This lecture was established to commemorate the memory of a great historian and a great mentor by his colleagues, his students, and his friends. This is our fourth lecture, and hopefully the lecture series will continue for as long as AB is there. Today, our lecturer is Professor Shavkat Pamuk. The name Pamuk, of course, perhaps needs no introduction on account of the two Pamuks, Shavkat as well as Orhan. Professor Shavkat Pamuk is a professor of economics and economic history at Boğaziçi University. Boğaziçi University is Bosphorus University, and as my friend and colleague Deringel says, is a sister institution to AUB. Professor Pamuk is a leading economic historian of the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East and Europe, and has published a great deal, many books in fact, including the Ottoman Empire and the European Capitalism, 1820 to 1913, this Cambridge University Press, A Monetary History of the Ottoman Empire, and this book I think was translated into Arabic as well. He was professor and chair for contemporary Turkish studies at the London School of Economics from 2008 to 2013. He served as president of the European Historical Economic Society in 2003 and 2005. He also served as president of Asian Historical Economic Society 2012-2014, and he is co-editor of the European Review of Economic History and is a member of Academia Europaea and Science Academy Istanbul. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pamuk.
Thank you. Thank you. I am honored to be here this evening to give this talk in honor of a distinguished historian, Professor Kamal Salibi. I would like to thank the Department of History and Archaeology and Professor Abu Hussein for this invitation. And I would like to also thank my good friend Mehmet Ali Neyzi for all his assistance in recent months. Well, we'll have to, okay. Can we do, yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, we'll find a, okay, thank you.
Okay.
We'll find our way. Okay, let me see. Okay. I am going to talk about plagues and the history of the Middle East this evening. And more specifically, there were these three worldwide pandemics. One beginning in the 6th century, the other one beginning in the 14th century, and there was a third one that began in the 19th century. I will be talking about the first two this evening. And I thought before I begin, I should try to explain a little why I chose to talk about plagues. You see here these three pandemics. They all originated in Asia, but then went through the Middle East and Europe. These were not one-off events. Each of these occurred for a initial period of 3-4 years, but they kept recurring. And each of these two pandemics literally lasted for centuries. And the population of the Middle East and Europe declined anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3, and according to some accounts, by even a larger fraction during each of these episodes. Well, historians of other regions have been interested in these episodes, and historians of the Middle East have also written about these events, but in my opinion, not sufficiently. In my opinion, there is a lot to be learned from these pandemics, and especially about the longer-term consequences of them. So, if you look today at what has been written about the Black Death and the Justinian Plague, of which more later, you find that historiography related to the Middle East has focused on demographic history, has focused on medical history, intellectual history, but there has been very little on social and economic history of these episodes. So I will be focusing more on them. And, well, basically, I will not be talking about the dead. I'll be talking about those who lived and what difference it made for those who survived these pandemics. And of course, this is an opportunity to talk about the Middle East in a global context. And I think that's one appeal for me, why I chose to talk about this topic this evening. And I hope that thinking about these pandemics will provide some new insights to the history of our region. And of course, Professor Salibi had wide-ranging interests, and he was very much interested in different periods. So I hope this will be a fitting tribute to his memory and to his work. Well, very simply, there is a bacterium called Yersinia Pestis, and this is the common element in these three pandemics. This bacterium lives on rodents, rats, mice, squirrels, and then travels with them. This bacterium travels in ships on rats, on trade routes, and this is how the disease was transmitted. And then, of course, the fleas then move from rats and, well, basically rats and mice to humans, and this is how the humans catch the disease, primarily. Again, I'm not so much interested in the medical aspects, but I will try to focus in my limited time on the social and economic history. But I do want to give you some sense of each of those two episodes, and I will begin with the Black Death because more is known about the Black Death, and there has been more studies, including studies on the Middle East. Again, the Black Death originated in the 14th century from Asia to the Middle East, and then through the Middle East, Constantinople, Cairo, Damascus, and so on, and then on to Europe. And of course, just to remind you, Asia at the time was united by the Mongols, and in fact, the unity of Asia helped transmit the disease towards Europe. The fact that the trade routes through Asia were active at this time made a big difference. And you can see here from Constantinople, it was transmitted very quickly to Cyprus, Cairo, and then to Italy, and on to Southern Europe, Western Europe. And within a period of 2, 3, 4 years, you can see most of the continent fell under the pandemic. But the one point I want to make about these episodes is that these pandemics were not limited to a short period at the beginning. They kept coming back. In the case of Western Europe, the recurrences lasted until the end of the 16th century. For Southern Europe, for Italy, for example, recurrences, let's say the Black Death, the pandemic kept coming back until the 17th century. And very interestingly, for our part of the world, around the Mediterranean, the disease persisted until the 19th century, until the 1840s. So there is already a big puzzle here. Why is it that it disappeared earlier in Western Mediterranean, Western Europe, but it persisted here, and it persisted also in Russia until much later date. Some historians, also medical historians, have argued that the quarantine was one reason for this glaring difference, but I think this is subject to debate. But at any case, the Black Death was in this part of the world, in this part of the Mediterranean, until the 1840s. And for that reason, there is a huge difference between Eastern Mediterranean, what happened in the Eastern Mediterranean, and what happened in Southern and Western Europe during the so-called early modern era. Now, I may be one of the first to point to this contrast in to the population growth of the Middle East and the rest of the world's leading regions during the early modern centuries, from 16th to 19th century. These are minor numbers I have gathered from basic population almanacs, population handbooks, and so on. You can see how not only the population of Europe, but the population of India, South Asia, and China have doubled, tripled, more than tripled in the case of Europe, from 1500 to 1820. But the population of Europe barely increased during these 3 centuries. Okay? So why was this so? Can we link this to the persistence of the disease? I think we can. I think we should. But if you look at the historiography, you will not see very much discussion of this. So this is one of the things I think we need to think about. It makes a huge difference. It brings, I think, an important new perspective to the demographic history of our region to think about the Black Death. And there have been some important books, some recently. These are the 4 books that I tend to think about when I think about Black Death in the Middle East. By those, that's a classic, was the study the initial, the first 3-4 years of the impact of the disease in Egypt. Stuart Borsch made a comparison more recently about Egypt and England, the impact of the disease and the contrast. Daniel Panzak, again, wrote more than 30 years ago about the later period of the disease across the Ottoman Empire, including Northern Africa, the Maghreb. And Nüket Varlık recently reminded everyone else in her award-winning dissertation about that the plague occurred, because I have to say that historians of the Middle East, and especially historians of the Ottoman Empire, have ignored the Black Death for too long. And the second plague is the earlier one, is called the Justinian Plague, because the initial outbreak was during the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. But as you can see here, again, this plague traveled from East Asia, again, through trade routes to the Middle East. But then it traveled through Middle East, Constantinople, but to Southern Europe, Western Europe, as far as Ireland and the British Isles. Just to remind you, at the time of the initial outbreak, in this part of the world was the Byzantine Empire. Okay? And then the plague, here is a summary of the recurrences of the plague. You can see on the horizontal axis the years in which the recurrences occurred, and they go all the way to the 8th century. And of course, by the 8th century, the political map had changed considerably. The Byzantine Empire now, by the 8th century, in the 7th, 8th centuries, is much smaller. And then we have the Islamic Empire and the Golden Age of Islam. So when I talk about the social and economic consequences of the plague, I do want to focus a little bit, spend a little bit of time, what the plague may have meant for this early period in Islamic history and the so-called Golden Age. But there is also more to the Justinian plague. Part of it is speculation, but part of it is also there is already mentioned in the literature that, of course, the Justinian plague was an important reason why the Byzantine Empire weakened significantly in the 6th century. Just the era of Justinian was, in fact, in many ways, the zenith of the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine historians are, most of them agree that this was a very important event for the Byzantine Empire. But by the same token, the weakening of the Byzantine Empire, demographically, and then as a result militarily, and again as a result fiscally, the idea that they could not collect the taxes to maintain their armies made a bigger difference in terms of the expansion of Islam in the early in the 7th century. And of course, there is also the argument that the Justinian plague had limited impact in the Arabian Peninsula. So the Islamic armies coming out of the Arabian Peninsula had not been subject to the plague, but whereas as they expanded into Syria, Egypt, and then to Iran, they in fact met states, armies that had already been weakened by the plague, and that may have been an important advantage to the Arabic armies. in the 7th century. Okay. And here is one recent book on the Justinian Plague. You can see that the emphasis here is not on a few years of the initial period, but the plague here is discussed in terms of a 2-century long period, and it's very much in the same spirit. I want to talk about the social and economic consequences of plagues this evening. Now, so let's say in the initial 3-4 year period, population declines significantly. Again, it changes from region to region, but for example, in Egypt, in the case of the Black Death, and then more generally in the Justinian Plague, Byzantine Empire, Middle East, 25, 30, 35% was some rough figure. So it's a huge decline in population, and unlike what Malthus had said 2 centuries ago, recovery of the population was by no means automatic. There were all sorts of reasons why population recovery was not swift. For one thing, the plague kept coming back every 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. Okay? And the death toll in each of these episodes was significant. Secondly, again, to bring together different kinds of literatures, fertility behavior was not constant. In other words, families, women, their behavior changed over time. Besim Musallam talked about birth control in medieval Egypt some years ago. He wrote a book in which he showed that women in Islamic Egypt practiced birth control. And so when times were difficult, times were uncertain, we should consider whether women, families practiced birth control, that during difficult times fertility may have been lower, namely women had fewer babies, and this may have been one reason why population recovery was slower. So what we end up with in these cases, in these episodes, is centuries of lower population, centuries of labor shortages. And this is where social and economic history comes in. And this is where I begin to focus on the economic consequences and the implications. We're talking about long periods of labor shortages and by implication, higher wages. And it's not only high wages, but all prices, relative prices change. With fewer people and lower demand for food, typically you have decline in agricultural prices, especially in prices of plants and crops which require less labor. So there is typically a decline in the prices of cereals. But there is a rise in the price of all other goods, manufactured as well as agricultural crops, food plants, which require more labor. So relative prices change. Incidentally, interest rates typically decline, wages rise. Okay? So you can look at it this way. The plague is a terrible thing. Large numbers of people die. But for those who survive, times are better. not only they have higher wages, but they also they all inherit the assets, the buildings, the land, the tools of those who died. Okay? So, and there is a general shift. There is more wealth per person, and there is also a shift in income distribution from capital towards labor. Times are better for those who survive because they have higher incomes. And that translates into changing new, different patterns of consumption with higher, not only higher incomes, but also higher levels of wealth. People begin to acquire new tastes, spend more money on high-income goods, let's say luxuries. Okay? So I'll talk about the implications of some of this, but there is this kind of shift in patterns of consumption as well as wealth and income you observe in most cases, all cases, most cases. And there are also some implications regarding technologies. Periods of labor shortage force all societies to think of ways of dealing with them, meaning periods of labor shortage force societies to find ways of saving labor in technology, technological innovations that save labor. Okay, so again, all of this is very speculative, but if we look at the case of Islam, but also the case of Europe, we see that this was a period when bigger ships began to be built in 14th, 15th century Europe to save on the labor. But interestingly, the printing press emerged during the Black Death. And I can't think of many other innovations that saved labor the way printing press saved labor. So perhaps we should think about those consequences. Having said that, I should also underline that there is nothing automatic about, well, some of these effects occur, but when it comes to some of the others, especially the technological innovations, there is nothing automatic, that each plague interacts differently with the environment and the institutions. So we can say that the relative prices change, wages rise and so on, and the consumption in luxury goods increases and so on, but we can't really say anything about technological innovations, long-term prosperity, and so on. These vary from one society to another. So I want to take you quickly through some graphs I have helped develop over the years regarding the long-term consequences of plagues. These are graphs about wages. We economic historians over the last 20, 30 years have been focusing for very long-term comparisons of different societies and different economies. We've been focusing on the wages of construction workers, exactly the kind of people who built these buildings here in the 19th century. Masons, but also unskilled construction workers. This was a standard occupation. Okay? And the wages of construction workers is often assumed to be somehow related to wages, to the incomes and productivity in agriculture. We can argue about that. But the point is that as a result, wages of construction workers is taken in my profession as reflecting the general income level in society. We don't have detailed data about average income levels, different income levels of different groups of people. But we do have detailed data, even for the early centuries of Islam, on the wages of unskilled workers. And so this kind of wage data allows us to make long-term comparisons of different societies, different economies. This is about wages in European cities, to which I added, these are collected by a colleague of mine, Robert Allen, who was a professor at Oxford for many years. He's now working at Abu Dhabi, and so he's getting interested in the economic history of the Middle East. And I've added to that his data, wages from Cairo and Istanbul. You can see something very interesting here in early modern Europe. Wages both in Middle East and Europe increased sharply up to the middle of the 15th century. And then in most of Europe and the Middle East, this lower half of the graph, you see wages declining back to their initial level. They shoot up after the initial impact of the plague, and then as population slowly recovers, wages decline. With the exception of Northwestern Europe, Britain, England, the Dutch, and in Belgium, wages stayed, and then we see this divergence. But divergence all the way to the Industrial Revolution, and so this divergence between Northern Europe and Southern Europe and the Middle East go back to the era of the plague. But what is common in this graph is the sharp rise in wages in the 14th century when the plague started, and the wages remain high until the second half of the 15th century. Then I put together this graph from data on Egypt, Cairo. Interestingly, we don't have data on medieval Europe, on wage data, price data, but we do have price and wage data for Cairo, Fustat and Cairo in the medieval era. So we can draw this graph. The Europeans cannot draw this graph, but historians of this region can draw this graph. At least for the moment, we can do this. So you can see this peculiar shape. You see each of these big episodes of the plague led to a sharp rise in wages, purchasing power of wages in terms of bread or wheat, and then there is a decline in each case. But the rise happens very quickly, but the decline is very gradual, literally taking centuries. Okay? And here is another graph I have drawn over the years. It's not only Cairo here, but I have added Istanbul and Baghdad. You can see the same shape, and this time I take it all the way to the Roman era. This is a graph of wages for 2,000 years. Okay? Again, this peculiar shape, the plagues come in, shoot the wages up in Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, and then they come back. But interestingly, high wages persist. Okay, let me go back to this one, okay? El-Makrizi talks about how wages doubled in Cairo during and aftermath of the Black Death. But there has been, we have evidence that wages then declined, and Stuart Borsch has argued recently that labor shortages were not very good for Egypt, because under severe shortages, it was very difficult to maintain the irrigation canals along the Nile. And with the irrigation canals falling into disrepair, productivity in agriculture began to decline, hence a decline in overall incomes. And then you see the decline in wages. But the story is perhaps a bit different. I mean, this is, let's say, a hypothesis. There is still debate on this one. But you can see in the next graph, the computer has decided to go on strike. It has a bug, yes. Well, let me just say that the plague, in the case of Istanbul, for example, the plague shot up the wages, and then thank you. You see that wages in the year 1800, three centuries later, were still lower than their levels in 1500. In other words, for the next 3 centuries, because the Black Death remained in the region, wages remained high, okay? But wages in 1500 remained higher than they were in 1500. With respect to this earlier period, this rise in wages during the earlier period, the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries in Cairo, is in part due to the rise in nominal wages, but it's also due to the fact that wheat and bread prices declined sharply. So ultimately, we're talking about the purchasing power of wages. So if cereal prices, wheat prices, bread prices decline, purchasing power of wages are still rising. And this is also due to a second cause. In the Byzantine era, Egypt was exporting large amounts of cereals to Constantinople. In the 6th and in the 7th century, these exports diminished. Some people have argued it was because the Muslim armies disrupted the trade. But no, I think there is another perspective here. The plague reduced the population of Constantinople, which in the 6th century was the biggest city in Europe. The plague had reduced the population of Constantinople so much that it did not need anymore the wheat exports from Egypt. And hence, with the collapse in demand, export demand, you have a sharp decline in wheat prices in Constantinople, in Egypt. Okay. So, in the remaining 10 minutes I want to talk about the implications of all of this environment of labor shortages, high incomes, high wages for the early centuries of Islam. After all, when we talk about the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, we're talking about the era of the Islamic Empire, the Islamic Golden Age. And roughly this era. And I am very much focusing on Egypt, Syria, Levant, and Iraq and Iran. Okay? And I just want to remind you that the early centuries of Islam was not only a period of prosperity, but it was a period of prosperity combined with a period of labor shortages and high wages. So I would like to speculate a little bit and also provide you some evidence how that interaction may change our understanding of the early centuries of Islam. Now, we know there is a lot of evidence that the so-called Golden Age of Islam was a period of high incomes. And high incomes for these kinds of early societies has to mean higher productivity in agriculture, because most of the people earn their living in agriculture. Agriculture must do well for a society in these early centuries, pre-modern societies, to prosper. So in during the Golden Age of Islam, agriculture was irrigated, highly productive, and there was also a good deal of long-distance trade, all of which led also to very high urbanization rate. Baghdad was a very large city, okay? 300,000, 400,000 people. Okay? And so then I want to talk about how this high level of productivity in agriculture and long-distance trade may have interacted with this environment of labor shortages and high wages. For one thing, we know how Islamic armies began to import slave soldiers into their armies. This is all historians are aware of this, how Islamic armies had slave soldiers imported. To what extent this practice is related to these labor shortages, I think we need to explore more carefully. And of course, in southern Iraq, there were also slaves imported, black slaves imported from East Africa, and they were working in agriculture until the slave rebellion at the end of the 9th century. Okay? So again, both of these things, slaves imported into the army, slaves imported from East Africa for agriculture, they suggest labor shortages were important. High wages, high incomes also had other implications for consumption, income, and patterns of production. We know from the studies by Andrew Watson, the Islamic Golden Age was a period of new plants. Many new plants, many food plants were brought in to the Middle East because a lot of people could afford them because they had higher incomes. And we also have a lot of evidence about a lot of specialization in new branches of production, the rise of new occupations, new skilled occupations. Again, evidence that perhaps it was the high wages that provide this. We know also that literacy was high during this period, use of paper spread, and large numbers of books, large volumes of books were produced during the era. We can also speculate to what extent the technological innovations in agriculture, food production, shipbuilding, textiles, chemicals, to what extent these were related to this environment of labor shortages and high incomes. Again, something for speculation, but I think it's worth pursuing. To what extent this environment of high wages and labor shortages had an impact on the development of early Islamic institutions. If you look at this early period, women had a lot of rights regarding property rights, inheritance rights, rights to keep their earnings. Okay? These are on the books. To what extent this the environment of labor shortages had something to do with the rise of or stronger rights for women in those early centuries, I think it's worth pursuing. So let me conclude. I've looked very quickly at the experience of the Middle East with the plague, the 2 episodes of the plague. One thing we could say is that this view of the pre-modern period of societies living on the edge of subsistence is really misleading. We know these 2 episodes of the plague, Justinian Plague from 6th to the 8th century, the Black Death from the 14th in our region to the 18th, 19th century, raised wages. So these societies were not at the edge of subsistence. And these demographic shocks, these plagues raised average incomes to 2 times, 3 times subsistence. Again, to repeat, large numbers of people died, but for those who survived, somehow their incomes were higher and they had access to greater wealth from which they could consume. And then this environment should force us to think how it may have interacted with the conditions of the early Islam. How favorable conditions, because of the conquests, because of political stability, irrigated agriculture, may have interacted with high wages and high incomes. But I should also add that not all plagues lead to the same outcome. Outcomes vary a good deal. What happens in Europe is very different. What happened in this region during the Black Death and what happened in this region during the Justinian Plague are very, very different. So my final point is, I think these episodes of the plagues have a lot to offer us in terms of insights into the history of this region. And I hope historians, myself included, historians in the future, will spend more time studying them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will open up the floor for 15 minutes for questions. Kindly, if you have a question or a comment, please be brief so we can move the questions around.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shauqa. My name is Tony Delbari. I'm a second cousin for Dr. Salibi. I am the only relatively I see Dr. Salibi. I'm a water engineer, graduate of AUB here, but very much interested in history and everything. I want to ask a question related about the wages. Why we compare them to wheat and not to gold? Dr. Salibi himself, he mentions in 1917 that the price of 1 bag of wheat in Lebanon, in the closing between the British Army and the 1 kilogram came to 1 golden coin.
Yeah.
So the reference in this thing, I think it should be the golden coins. Number 2, as I remember from my grandfathers and everything, and from Dr. Salibi and everything, there's always a reference to the golden coin. A worker daily wage is a golden coin, etc., etc. So I think
okay.
I think the reference should be more than about the golden coin in this regard. This is a general question, commentary.
If you give me a piece of paper, I'll take
We
note.
don't need to forget that Rebecca itself was the place of Rome, the Silas of the Silas of Rome here in Lebanon, about when we speak of
Okay.
We will
Okay.
take 2 more questions, and we will pause a bit, then ask more questions.
Walid Marouche, Lebanese American University, Associate Professor of Economics. Caught my attention your table on the population. You can go to that table, please. So there is an influential paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, 2011, that argues that the population explosion, demographic explosion in Europe
Potatoes.
is due to the potatoes.
Yes.
That was introduced from Latin America, first by the Spaniards,
Yeah.
then by the French. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Who else? One more.
Okay.
Hocam hoş geldiniz öncelikle. I'm Mustafa Gül from Boğaziçi University, doing exchange here this semester. And my question is about, we saw the outcomes can vary from society to society, but I wonder why the outcome for Byzantine Empire was bad, let's say, whereas it was good for the Islamic Empire of the 7th century.
Okay. Okay, should I try this? Okay. About the golden coin, ultimately wages are paid and bread is paid and wheat paid in coins. So as you said, we can measure these in gold coins. But the point is, prices change over time. Prices in gold coins or grams of gold also change over time, prices and wages. Just as we experience, say, inflation in terms of the Lebanese lira, okay, or the dollar, there was inflation in terms of the gold coin. So when we say we're looking at comparing the purchasing power of the daily wage, that is a better measure because of this inflation. In fact, as part of one of my papers, I noticed I realized that there was considerable inflation in terms of gold coins from the 7th and 8th century to the 11th and 12th centuries. Prices almost increased by 50% or so. So there is inflation even in gold. For that reason, to do this in terms of the purchasing power of the wage, however much it was in gold, is the more proper method. But now the potato, and more generally about the different impact of the plagues. Again, I don't want to say that the plague ultimately explains everything, all the differences. The conditions of the plague, high wages, labor shortages, is one of many things in the picture. We don't know why the potato was adopted slowly in this region. Okay, but perhaps the need was less urgent for the potato, and one important reason I suspect is that when you look at these centuries, the Middle East did not have large population, and the population pressure on land was not as intense here as it was in other parts of Asia. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why potato was adopted slowly. In other words, while, for example, that study shows potato made a difference in East Asia, but they're talking about, for example, sweet potato there. I think there was not much pressure on land. People were not going hungry because they couldn't find anything to eat. There were other reasons why population, in fact, overpopulation was not a constraint in this region. So I don't think potato would have made as much a difference in this region. And again, potato was also interacting with very different institutions, and that also probably helps explain the difference. I would say the same thing about Byzantine Empire or early Islam or late medieval Europe. Ultimately, these plagues interact with what is on the ground, and with a good deal of institutions, political conditions, and the results can be very different. Even inside Europe, the Northwestern Europe, Northern Europe, and Southern Europe behaved very differently in the aftermath of the Black Death. So for that reason, Byzantine Empire had a much difficult time dealing with the plague, whereas early Islam had also all sorts of perhaps favorable winds, political stability, and as a result, they were helped by the plague, or the plague put them on a specific trajectory, a specific model of development that favored these luxury goods, high-income goods, and so on. So things can vary a good deal.
Thank you, Professor Pamuk. I have a methodological question. Your speculations about women's rights and this kind of environment of increased wages and increased income in relation to women's rights makes me wonder how you use or relate to the intellectual history data, right? So on the one hand, you have doctrinal, or if you like, ideational positions on women and all sorts of other social phenomena, and then you have this economic data. And how do you read across those two terrains, if you see what I mean?
Well, it's not ideational, and I think I am referring to studies on Islamic law in the medieval era, okay? And studies I have seen on early centuries on law and women's rights on early Islamic era show a good deal of rights for women, property rights for women, earnings rights for women, and so the speculation is, again, I'm not an expert on this, but this is precisely the question that historians of law and Islamic law should focus on. Could this very specific environment have had an effect on the rise of these institutions, on the specific legal trajectory during this period? But I'm not providing answers because though that's not my area. I can talk much more certainly with much more comfortably about incomes and consumption patterns and so on.
Hi, my name is Dosan Abdurrahim. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm in the Faculty of Health Sciences, so I've read a little bit about the history of the plague. Some of the writings on Europe have have really addressed the issue of how the plague has changed the social systems in Europe, not only changing the labor relationships, but also the social dynamics. Some argue that it has precipitated the Renaissance and the weakening of the church in Europe. Have you looked at anything related to this in the Middle East area? And has the plague had any effect on the power of religion and social hegemonic structures in the region?
No, I didn't. I think it's an interesting point. I can tell you other things hugely different. Each of these societies have their own social structure, institutions, rules, and the plague interacts very differently. It's been argued for a long, long time that the plague led to the dissolution of feudalism in England, for example, just as you talk about the weakening of the church. That doesn't mean that it will do the same in other areas, but I think you're raising exactly the kinds of questions that I think we should raise. My point is that most historians of this region, certainly the historians of the Ottoman Empire, have never had the Black Death in their radar. I'll give you another example. Again, political history, basic. I think the Black Death had everything to do with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into Europe, across Constantinople and into Europe. In Europe, the Ottomans in the 14th century, think about the timing. The Ottomans crossed into Europe only a couple of years after the Black Death hit the region. And they kept moving and expanding. And you will not find a single reference in Ottoman historiography of the 15th century on Ottoman expansion into Europe, in the Balkans, about the Black Death. In fact, I asked once someone in a lecture, let me say that my colleague had not heard of the Black Death, okay? And she had never considered this as a possibility. But this is the kind of thing I think we need to think about. I think your question is very helpful. I don't know the answer, but these are the kinds of big questions we should keep in mind. And what happened in this region will not be the same as what happened in Europe. But it is worth thinking about how the Black Death may have played a role in whatever the outcome.
Hi, my name is Badriya Jilai. I'm a master's in history student. I have just one small question. In your opinion, would you compare the effects of the Black Plague in the economic and socio-economic sphere as similar, to have similar implications as, let's say, World War I or World War II, only in the social and economic sphere?
Well, what is the impact of World War I and World War II? If you tell me that, perhaps then I can answer. Because World War I, World War II they had very complicated effects. I can tell you that World War I and World War II had all sorts of very complicated effects on technology, state organization, okay, mobilization of resources, and so on and so forth. They were big events. In that sense, yes, these are also very big events, but also remember, World War I and World War II, by the standards of the plague, were short events. Each lasted 4 years, But I'm talking here about 2 episodes, each of which lasted 2-3 centuries. Okay? So, big events, a lot of change. I can't put a number on them, which one was more important, but I'd say that they were also very, very important. And also I would add that World War I was also an unexpected event. You know, in World War I, for a long time, all sides kept thinking that the war would end in a few weeks, in a few months, but it didn't. So the Black Death, there is a similarity there. It kept on coming back.
Thank you, Dr. Pamuk, for this very insightful lecture. And I have a remark in some ways that probably makes you realize that the impact of your lecture on me this evening. In the way we study early Islamic history, we don't really. In the way we study early Islamic history,
yes.
we do not usually reflect on the impact of the Black Death. And here, in the very early of the conquest, there was a serious incident that reopened the plague, Ta'un Amwas, that wiped out some of the leadership of the Muslim army. And that prepared the way for Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan to become the governor of Syria and subsequently to become caliph. I don't think there has been serious studies done on whether it had an impact on reducing the thrust of the conquest. It doesn't seem, but all our evidence comes from later. But in caveat, there is something else that I want to mention here, that when Caliph al-Walid was building the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and his palace, which is under the Aqsa Mosque, he asked for laborers from Egypt, Christian laborers from Egypt. And we have actually papyri that mention requests that he sent and answers from a patriarch in southern Egypt, who seemed to be displeased that badly needed laborers to be sent somewhere else. And now I'm putting the two together in terms of shortages that might explain such a bizarre demand, why you are in Damascus building a structure in Jerusalem needing laborers from southern Egypt. So that might help explain labor shortages and need to look elsewhere. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any more? Last question?
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I teach, actually, this sort of stuff to development students. Kamal Salibi's erstwhile colleague, Lawrence Conrad, actually looked at the first plague, the plague of Justinian, and one of the things he pointed out was that perhaps the Umayyad palaces, which are built in the desert, were a strategy for escaping the plague, which hit the cities and the settled areas much more strongly. So my question to you would be, would it be better to actually pursue the insight which he seems to be pointing towards, which is one of the environmental, the environment as a conditioning effect on the plague, the presence, for instance, of pastoralism and nomadism, much more in the Middle East than in Europe, when you look at the differences, rather than dealing with this kind of neoclassical economic approach, which is basically about static allocation, and then you throw institutions as an addition. And of course there are Ottomanists like Sam White who've done precisely that. They looked at plague, but also looked at things like the shifts in the weather in the 17th century, and come up with much more complicated stories where you bring the environment into history rather than impose upon it a kind of a different perspective coming from outside and coming from something like neoclassical economics, which is completely static. Would it be a better approach to bring it through?
That's not true.
But no, and we can also go into Europe, where you see the big differences between East and Western Europe, which a whole line of less orthodox economists, from Dobb to Brenner, have actually explained in terms of class struggle rather than these market scarcities.
Well, I think in a few sentences you mix too many things all at once. So I'm having a difficult time trying to respond to all of them because all the things you talk about interact. For one thing, I don't think I'm talking about static comparisons. I'm bringing in technology and how the direction of technology, which once you bring the direction of technological change and the fact that the environment of the plague may have had an impact on technological change, you're not talking about statics anymore. It's very different. If there is an environment of labor shortages and it leads to new labor-saving technologies, then all these other comparisons do not apply. And also I have pointed out something else, which makes it very complicated. I'm not talking about, in many of these neoclassical models, about automatic recovery of the population. Many of these models assume recovery of population and that wages decline. I'm saying fertility behavior is also complex. It interacts with all sorts of things, and population recovery is not automatic, so we don't know. I think there are many different models that help, but let's put it this way. Danny Rodrik says, I don't know whether you've read some of his latest books. Danny Rodrik says the trick in economics, there are all sorts of models. A good economist finds which model to apply to which condition. So if we apply one model to all the plagues, I think that would be the wrong thing to do. We have to find out what, for each plague perhaps, to find what kind of model to apply. Okay.
Thank you. I would like to thank you, Professor Bamu, for doing this great lecture, and I also would like to thank everyone who attended. Next year, we will be meeting you with the 5th annual Kamal Salibi lecture. See you next year. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for all your time. I am honored to have you here until the end of the lecture. Thank you very much.
I'm a friend of Kamal.